have question number 1, which if I read, I'm just going to go ahead and speed read through. In a 1954 Life magazine article, author John Hershey expressed concern that children in the United States were disengaged from learning how to read. Among other problems, Hershey noted the reading material available to grade schoolers had a hard time competing with television, radio, and other media for children's attention. So here you just have a nice list and just nice, easy question number 1. They're just giving us a list and asking us to separate apart the pieces in the list. So television, radio, and other media. So nice, easy, choice A on number 1. Going over to number 2 now. The writer wants to include a quotation by Hershey that supports the topic of this passage. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So here we're being asked for something that supports the topic of this passage. So this is the question we refer to as an excuse for the main idea. So what a lot of students wouldn't actually do here is they won't actually take the time to say to themselves, okay, well, what is the main idea? And so we have to take an extra second to do that. So looking through the passage, now we can read a little less word for word and a little more skipping through because we just need to get the topic of this passage. So we've got this author has concern that children are disengaged from learning how to read. So the reading material wasn't able to compete with other media. So the solution was to make children's books more interesting. And that was how the Cat in the Hat became a thing. And he went to a publishing company with his idea. They agreed that there is a need for more appealing stuff. And he arranged to have dinner with an author, the author of Dr. Seuss. So this is all part of this initiative to make the reading more enjoyable for children. He knew Spalding for many years, had this relationship with him. So we're going through the whole passage, kind of speed reading here. There was an obstacle. He told him to write it from a restricted vocabulary with 2 stories. He abandoned them. Okay, on the verge of giving up, he came up with the idea of the cat with the stovepipe hat, the Cat in the Hat. His main character established, he commenced the task of writing with limited vocabulary. The book was a big hit. It had just a little bit of information about it. And it had inspired another publishing house to establish a series for early readers. In the years that followed, many talented writers and illustrators imitated the formula. And the success is not its influence, but its limited vocabulary and appealing word choices. So a lot of things we're talking about the inception of the Cat in the Hat series and how we wanted sort of a simpler story for children with the limited vocab, and how it started the idea of the Cat in the Hat series and how it was incredibly successful. So let's go ahead and look through the answer choices and see which of these jives with this main idea. So just bringing in the other chapter now, the other sort of page of this. Let me go ahead and just take a second to paste this in. Nice thing for online tutors and even in-person tutors to think about is the idea of pasting in a previous page so that you can lead your students to read with more continuity the way we're doing here. We'll just go ahead and cover that up right there. Okay, so Hershey noted the reading material had a hard time competing with television, radio, and other media. One solution he proposed was to make children's books more interesting, since an individual's sense of wholeness follows and cannot precede a sense of accomplishment. So was this whole thing about creating in students a sense of accomplishment? I don't think it was. So in number 2, we're making reading more interesting since learning starts with failure. The first failure is the beginning of education. I also don't think we're hearing a lot about failure here. It's interesting because journalism allows its readers to witness history. Fiction gives readers an opportunity to live it, to live history. Was this about history? Well, we're just continually going back to what we said when we looked at this in our own words. In our own words, we said it was the success of the Cat in the Hat, that there was a simpler story with limited vocab. So as we look through the answer choices, that's in essence what we're looking for. And going to choice D, interesting with drawings like those of wonderfully imaginative geniuses among children's illustrators. So let's just read that one again real quick. Among other problems, Hersey noted the reading material available to grade schoolers had a hard time competing with television, radio, and other media for children's attention. One solution he proposed was to make children's books more interesting with drawings like those of wonderfully imaginative geniuses among children's illustrators. So, okay, I'm not loving this answer choice, and that happens to us. Sometimes we're not loving one, but we're talking about imagination, a great deal of imagination, which goes along with the idea of the Cat in the Hat. It was incredibly imaginative, and the story does talk a lot about that. And children's illustration also was kind of a big theme, even though it wasn't what we said in our own words. The idea that this is kind of being directed at children with the needs of children in mind. So we don't love choice D here, but it's definitely not about history, definitely not about failure, and definitely not about encouraging accomplishment. So if I'm in a real SAT here and I'm debating, I'm going to pick the answer that I hate the least, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let's go over to number 3. The story of the Cat in the Hat publication began when William Spalding, the director of the education division at the publishing company Houghton Mifflin, read Hersey's article and had an idea. Okay, so looking here, just reading it on my own first, I am seeing things that seem to work. William Spalding, the director of the education division at the publishing company Houghton Mifflin. This piece right here is an incredibly important thing to be able to identify. This is what we refer to as our middle modifier. Our middle modifier. Now, what is a modifier? A modifier is a clause that's missing the subject, the verb, or both. So what's a clause? A clause has a subject and a verb. You have independent clauses that can be their own, dependent clauses that are subjects with a conjunction in the front. So really quick, independent clause would be something like John went to the mall. A dependent clause would be something like since John went to the mall. Because of the word since, it can't be its own sentence anymore. And a modifier is something that is missing the subject, the verb, or both. So notice that in this purple part, there's no mention of he was the director of. That would make it a clause. So this is a modifier, and we want to be really, really familiar with the idea of the modifier in the middle of our sentence, because we've got a sentence that works if you ignore the purple part. The story of the Cat in the Hat's publication began when William Spalding read Hersey's article and had an idea. So that works. That's kind of the point of a modifier. If it's deleted, the rest of the sentence is okay. So now based on that, we can go ahead and say that we like choice A. So we'll kind of leave that for later. If we're thinking of a modifier in the middle, then B doesn't work because we want our comma right here. A modifier needs to be separated by commas on both sides, and we have this comma, so the other comma seems appropriate. What's wrong with C? It's got an extra comma. So the modifier would read the director of the education division. So keep your ears open for when we mention the 6 reasons for a comma. And this right here is simply not one of them. That's not one of our 6 reasons for a comma. And then looking at choice D, we want to be really firm on the definition of when to use a colon, semicolon, and long dash. So the colon is for when the first part's an independent clause, the second part is anything that describes the first part. The semicolon separates 2 independent clauses, 2 things that could be their own sentence. And the long dash, if you have one of them, it counts as a colon. So to judge D right here, we're looking for it's according to the rules for a colon. The first part should have been an independent clause, which is not the case. The part before the blue part right here couldn't be its own sentence. And the second part would have to describe the first part. The second part actually does kind of describe the first part here. So I'm more okay with that. But no colon, no long dash as a colon, because the part before the long dash, which counts as a colon, is not an independent clause. So we're going on number 3 with choice A. Going over to number 4 now. Which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? So effectively combining is one of our big one-liners, one of our big things that we want to have memorized. When you're effectively combining two sentences, you want to read it fast, looking for flow. Flow can also involve conciseness. So something's going to flow better if it doesn't have unnecessary words. We want to have good transitions. Transitions will be transitional words like however or furthermore, or will also be transitional punctuation like a semicolon or a colon. We want to have good word order. It's a little more rare, but sometimes a wrong answer choice will have all the right words, but they're in the wrong order, and that messes them up. And last but not least, we want to avoid restarting. So what's restarting? It's a little different than repeating. Repeating, I would consider more something that would mess up the flow of a sentence, but restarting is the idea of restarting as kind of a new sentence or a new idea when we've already kind of started our idea. So for instance, I might say, or a third grader might say, school is fun. It is my favorite place. Whereas if we're going to be a little more concise and we're going to avoid restarting, we'll just say, school is my favorite place, or, the really fun school is my favorite place, or some way to just present that as a single idea. And we want a single idea for something simple rather than multiple ideas, unless the nature of the idea requires it being expressed in two separate ways, then we have a good reason to restart. But in general, we want to avoid it. So looking at the choices here for number 4, just deleting some of this distracting information here. For number 4, we have Spalding agreed that there was a need for appealing books for beginning readers. He thought he knew who should write one. So we kind of have it as two sentences. I mean, we don't even have the original thing that's in here as a choice, but the idea is that it's two sentences and it needs to be joined together. Okay, so going through this, just looking at the answer choices here, it seems to be about the transitional punctuation. So should we have a long dash? We said that a long dash, if there's only one, functions as a colon. The first part could be an independent clause, and the second part could be anything that describes the first part. So let's see if that works for choice B. Spalding agreed that there was a need for appealing books for beginner readers. Namely, he thought he knew who should write one. So the second part, so this counts as a colon. If you have one long dash, it's a colon. And the rule for the colon is the first part's an independent clause. That's okay. The second part describes the first part, and that is not true here. The idea of who should write it is a whole new idea. It's not describing what they talked about earlier. So now going to the semicolon, semicolon is for two independent clauses. So do we have two independent clauses here? It's fairly easy to see that we actually don't, because the way C is worded, the second part starts with "and Spalding thought." So we wouldn't start a sentence, an independent clause, with and therefore the semicolon for C is bad. D is kind of wrong because when we're talking about transitions here, meanwhile would be like, when would you use meanwhile? Meanwhile would be if something is happening and at the same time, meanwhile at some other place, but at the same time in our story, this other thing happened, right? So this is kind of a bad transition. There's nothing about the sentence that requires the use of the word meanwhile. That's not the thing that's happening here. So does A flow? He thought he knew who should write one, and he arranged to have dinner with Theodore Giesel, who wrote and illustrated children's books under the name Dr. Seuss, and issued him a challenge. Another thing that I hadn't even noticed yet which is the idea that we already have a colon in the sentence. So we wouldn't want anything like a colon or a semicolon earlier in the sentence if we're going to have a colon later. So that's another aspect of it. But more importantly, if you have two independent clauses, you want to join them with a semicolon or a comma conjunction. So two independent clauses, we need to know that you need a semicolon or a comma and a conjunction. And here, when we're talking about two independent clauses, we're talking about a strong conjunction, a fanboys, like and, for, but, so, words like that. And we do have one of those. So A is good because it joins our two independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction. So just notice that everything on the left side of the comma and could have been its own sentence, and everything on the right side of the comma and, if you read into the sentence here, could have been its own sentence, and that would have worked. So we're picking A for number 4. Going on to number 5 now. Having known Spalding for many years and having maintained a professional relationship with him, excuse me, sorry about that. Giesel was an experienced writer and illustrator. So question number 5 says, which choice best supports the information that follows in the sentence? So if we need to support the information that follows, this is our question that's basically giving us our excuse for the main idea. One of our most common questions that we're going to get on section 2 of the SAT. So we need to take our time, in a timed test. We're often in a rush, but we don't stop to think that not only are we in a rush, but we need to use our time for the right things. So you'll always hear that in our instruction. There are moments where if you don't just stop for a moment and say, okay, what's going on here? Then you will not be properly equipped to answer the question. So we need the information that follows in the sentence. And that's nice and easy to identify here. Giesel, however you say it, was an experienced writer and illustrator. So we want something that goes with the main idea of this sentence, that this person was experienced as a writer and illustrator. So which one goes with that? He acquired a reputation for perfectionism and for setting high standards for his work. Perfectionism and high standards, I don't think goes with experience off the top of my head. Sounds really close, right? But if you're a perfectionist, that doesn't mean you're experienced at something. That Giesel, let's see, having been interested in politics before breaking into children's literature, being interested in politics has nothing to do with being an experienced writer or illustrator. Looking at choice D now. Giesel, having published 9 children's books and having received 3 nominations for the prestigious Caldecott Medal. So 9 children's books to the point where he was nominated for a medal. That is an experienced writer and children's illustrator right there. So we're loving choice D for number 5. And last but not least, having known Spalding for many years and maintained a relationship with him. So the fact that they knew each other doesn't necessarily, and that they had a professional relationship, that could be talking about a relationship outside of children's publishing. So maybe I would have liked A little, but we love choice D for question number 5. Now going over to number 6. Number 6, you can see when you quickly look at it, is all about transitional words. So we have, for example, furthermore, at any rate, and our one-liner for transitional words is invent your own. Doesn't sound like much, but what happens here is we're so interested in navigating between the answer choices that we shortchange the process of really understanding what's going on. So when you're inventing your own word, it forces you to truly understand what you read before and after. So looking before, we know that Spalding was an experienced writer and illustrator. That's the main part of what comes before the transition. This project presented him with an obstacle. So what's the relationship between being really experienced and getting an obstacle? They're opposites of one another. So I want a word like however or but. And choice A gives us the however. Now, by the way, however, as a transitional word, is the most common, and you want to be on the lookout for it. It's very, very common on the SAT to hear something like they were all pumped up to embark on a new project. However, when it began, they experienced some problems. So that is our most common transitional word that we experience on the SAT. Going into number 7 now. Giesel started 2 stories only to abandon them when he found that he needed to use words that were not on the list. On the verge of giving up, Giesel's story finally hit upon an image that became its basis. Okay, so there are a few things going on here. We need to talk about our transitional, our special punctuation, colon, semicolon, and long dash. And we also need to talk about something a little different. So the rule to know about here is when a sentence starts with a modifier, that's missing the subject needs to lead the second part of the sentence. So I can kind of verbally here give you an example of that. Having gone to the playoffs nearly, well, I'm a basketball fan, so pardon me if you're not, but having gone to the playoffs nearly every year of his career, comma, I'm pausing for an extra moment there to kind of emphasize that the more we describe someone without mentioning the person, the more suspense we're going to create. So having gone to the playoffs nearly every year of his career, comma, LeBron James won the championship in blah, 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 whatever year. So a sentence is starting with a modifier. It's missing the subject. In my example, it was missing any mention of LeBron James. So the more we do that, the more we need to lead with LeBron James for the second part. So here in our sentence, we have on the verge of giving up. So who was on the verge of giving up? Giesel finally hit upon the image that became the basis for his story. So we kind of already know, looking at number 7, without even considering whether the use of the colon is correct, that C has to be the right choice. But also discussing it in terms of the definition of the colon. For the colon, like we said, the first part is an independent clause. The second part is anything that describes the first part. So the first part needs to be an independent clause. So the modifier doesn't count. On the verge of giving up, Giesel finally hit upon the image that became the basis for his story. So that is an independent clause. That part right there, the part that I'm going to highlight fully in blue here, could have been its own sentence. And the second part needs to describe the first part. So what was the image that became the basis of his story? A cat wearing a battered stovepipe hat. So the first part is an independent clause. The second part is something that describes the first part. So the definition of the colon fits perfectly for number 7. So the answer for 7 is C. Going into number 8, Giesel commenced the difficult task of writing a book with a limited vocabulary. At the end of a duration 9 months long, The Cat in the Hat was complete. So I don't hate choice A. It's a little awkward, maybe, but there's nothing egregiously wrong about it. Looking at choice B, after 36 weeks or 9 months had passed, so I don't hate it. Nothing necessarily grammatically wrong about it. Going to choice C, after a length of 9 months had elapsed. Once again, nothing terrible about it. 9 months later. Okay, so what's this question about? Learn to identify when one answer choice is much shorter than the rest. Not always, but very frequently, this can be about conciseness. Conciseness basically says that unless I'm adding something that is totally necessary, I want the shortest way to say something. So when one answer choice is so much shorter than the others, you want to have your eyes open to the idea that it might just be a question about conciseness. We emphasize this a little extra because it's a little harder to pick up than some of the other things you see in section 2. So choice D is very concise and it says all the same stuff as the other answer choices. So then it's better. So another way to say this is all of the other answer choices they're all kind of grammatically correct. So if they're all grammatically correct, it's going to be kind of hard to choose between them. And chances are it's not about the grammar, it's about how short it is. So that's number 8. And let's go ahead and look at number 9 now. The book was a hit. Children were entertained by its plot about the antics of a mischievous cat and is captivated. So what is captivated? It's kind of losing the power of its pronoun. Like if I'm fixing it on my own before looking at the answer choices, which we love doing, children were entertained by its plot about the antics of a mischievous cat and its. Oh, okay. So now we're reading into this part. Children were entertained by its plot about the antics of a mischievous cat and were captivated by its eye-catching illustrations and memorable rhythms and rhymes. So who are we talking about right here? Who was captivated? Well, let's see to who they talked about before. The children were entertained and the children were captivated. So I want a pronoun. I want a word that relates to the fact that we're talking about how the children were, not a pronoun, but the idea that the children were captivated. And the children were captivated by its eye-catching illustrations. So children was, children has been. Those are just going to be terrible because they're singular. And we're talking about the plural children. So once again, is, choice A is also singular. So we've gotten rid of A, B, and C because we're talking about children in the plural, and A, B, and C are all singular. So does deleting it work? We can kind of read it in place there. Children were entertained by its plot about the antics of a mischievous cat and captivated by its eye-catching illustrations. So I might refer to what's going on question 9 by something that the SAT and ACT people love doing, which we refer to as the stylish deletion of a word or words. So what's going on there? It's a situation where with the word totally deleted, we can still understand the meaning. And the way the sort of test prep writers see this, if we can understand the meaning with no words there, then the words are deemed unnecessary. And that's a really kind of funky grammatical dynamic to pick up on, but something to be aware of and put to the test as you do different questions. So now we're going over to question number 10. Question number 10 is simply about special punctuation. So let's take a second to kind of define these. We've talked about them a couple times so far today. If we have a colon, we need to fit the rule for a colon, which is the idea that the first part is an independent clause, and the second part is anything that describes the first part. So an example of a colon was, there was only one thing Scooby could do. Run. That was my entertainment for this SAT broadcast. You're welcome. But you could also have it a lot longer. So another example, I'm not going to type this one out, would be, after weeks of deliberation, the board of directors decided upon a solution to their financial conundrum, colon. They decided to fire their accounting department. So the definition is the same, whether it's a short sentence or a long one. The first part has to be independent, has to be able to stand on its own. The second part is anything that describes the first part. When we say anything, we generally mean independent clause, dependent clause, or modifier as our three main sentence structural elements. So now moving on to the semicolon. For a semicolon, you need two independent clauses on either side of the semicolon. So, one of my classic sentence examples, John went to the mall. He bought shoes, not a colon, a semicolon. He bought shoes. I don't get paid for my typing skills, sorry. And last but not least, the long dash. The long dash would be one long dash counts as a colon, and you go right over to that rule for the colon, and judge whether it fits. And 2 long dashes counts as a set of parentheses. So kind of a little complicated. And as I said in our podcast yesterday, a little surprising that there are some tutors out there and some moderately successful tutors that are not familiar with these rules. So if you're one of those people, snap out of it. You need to know these rules so you can help your students as well as possible. And so the colon definition, even though we don't see a colon, is actually very relevant here because there's the long dash, and 1 long dash counts as a colon. So let's start going through here. In the years that followed, period. So what's technically wrong with A? There's in the years that followed, there's no subject. So there's nothing that happened. This happened, or this was the case in the years that followed. So there's no subject to that sentence. That would be technically what's wrong with A. So choice B, for the semicolon, you need 2 independent clauses. In the years that followed, semicolon. So just like we said for A, the first part is not a clause. It has no subject. So we can't use a semicolon. The part before the semicolon cannot be its own sentence. It's not an independent clause. Looking at choice C, in the years that followed, many talented writers and illustrators of children's books imitated Giselle's formula of restricted vocabulary and whimsical artwork. So you have a comma, which means that the first part is a modifier because like we said for choices A and B, the part before the comma or before the punctuation doesn't have a subject. There's nothing that happened in the years that followed, right? So it's okay to have a modifier separated by a comma and then go ahead and start your independent clause after that. That's perfect. A modifier, if we can define it a little more formally, a modifier has 5 attributes. A modifier is a clause that's missing the subject, the verb, or both. So here, when we say in the years that followed, there's nothing that happened in the years that followed, so there's no subject. A modifier is a clause missing the subject, the verb, or both. If it's deleted, the rest of the sentence is okay. So that alone doesn't make it a modifier because that's also true for dependent clauses. It can go at the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence. Here we have it at the beginning. The most common one is in the middle. John, who dates Tina, went to the mall. It's always separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. And so we have that in choice C. And last but not least, it provides extra optional information. So those are the 5 attributes of a modifier. And for choice C, our modifier does that. It's missing the subject. If it were to leave, the rest of the sentence is okay. It's at the beginning. It's separated by commas. And it's a little extra information. The main part of the sentence is that this thing happened. Talented writers and illustrators imitated the formula, but a little extra information, that thing happened in the years that followed. So just a quick word about why choice D is wrong. 1 long dash counts as a colon. So we're judging right here as if this were a colon. And the rule for the colon is the first part has to be an independent clause. And we've talked at length about how the part leading up to that long dash is not an independent clause. It couldn't be its own sentence. So D is wrong. So now we're going on to question 11. The writer wants a conclusion that restates the main themes of the passage. So we want to restate the main themes of the passage. And so this is our question that we refer to as our excuse for the main idea. So we already talked a few times about the main themes of the passage. It was about a simpler book for children. It was about the starting of the Cat in the Hat series. It had limited vocab and was extremely creative and written by a very established author of children's books who had won many medals before that. So we want to restate any of those themes. So perhaps the best proof of the Cat in the Hat's success is not its influence on other books, but its limited vocabulary and appealing word choices. So limited vocab fits very much with what we were saying, so we'll keep that. Its impressive worldwide sales that continue to remain high to this day. Nothing about impressive sales, so we can get rid of choice B. Its enduring ability to delight children and engage them in learning how to read. So we like that one because that kind of goes with the idea of a simpler book for children. And last but not least, its important role in the history of illustration. So we can definitely right off the bat get rid of choices B and D. So now, is it more about the limited vocabulary and appealing word choices, or more about the role in the history of, or I'm sorry, or more about the enduring ability to delight children and engage them in learning how to read? If we're not sure, which I personally wouldn't be sure at this point, let's kind of glance through the story again and see what we find. So here we have concern that children were disengaged from learning how to read. So perhaps in our own analysis of this, we haven't really talked about that enough. So children are disengaged from learning how to read, and it was because the reading material was boring. So the proposal was this idea of this other type of story that ended up being a big hit. So if we look back on the main idea, I could maybe sort of change my own assessment of the main idea, which, more important than anything that we mentioned before, is the idea that kids were disengaged, and the idea of the cat in the hat was invented as a solution to that. So coming back to this, talented writers and illustrators of children's books imitated Gisel's formula of restricted vocabulary and whimsical artwork. But, now this is a little word here about why A is not really good, because they said there was this formula of restricted vocabulary and whimsical artwork, but the success was the enduring ability to delight children and engage them in learning how to read. So choice C goes with the very beginning of the passage, that kids were disengaged and we're looking for a solution to that. But also the idea of restricted vocabulary, which is kind of what I maybe originally thought we were going to lean toward here, was already mentioned. So restricted vocabulary, but we're going to talk about something different now. So we can't necessarily talk about restricted vocabulary all over again. And that's the problem with choice A. So for number 11, we're going with choice C. Going on to number 12 now. A growing number of public schools in the United States require students to complete community service hours to graduate. Such volunteering, be it helping at a local animal shelter, now I'm correcting on my own. Such volunteering, be it helping at a local animal shelter, picking up litter, or working at a healthcare facility, has obvious benefits. So as we approach these questions in general, you want to read as fast as you can, even if you have to skip a couple of words, because when you read fast, you get the main gist of everything. And you want to be willing to correct on your own, not as a final thing that, you know, will finally endure, but just as allowing your unconscious mind to kind of give you a hunch of what's going on here. So you want to be reading fast and you want to be correcting on your own whenever possible before you look at the answer choices. So we kind of picked up on the idea that this volunteering, that there's a list. Such volunteering, be it helping at an animal shelter, picking up litter, or working at a healthcare facility, choice D does that. So the idea here is that when you have a list, you want to look out for parallelism. So I like running, biking, and jogging, or I like to run, to bike, and to jog, but I don't want to mix and match. If it's in a list, you want to say everything in the list the same way every time. So the answer to number 12 is going to be D. Now we're going over to number 13. The writer wants a transition from the previous paragraph that highlights the criticism of compulsory volunteering mentioned in the previous paragraph. So this is our nice little excuse for the main idea. They're saying, well, before we get into that, if you have an excuse for the main idea, that kind of question, the one-liner is going to be announce it. It's one of these things that sounds like you're not doing anything, but the way a lot of these questions are written, when you just announce, when you say, okay, this is what's going on, then you look at the answer choices, you'll notice that very frequently, one of them exactly says that. So if you go the extra mile, remember, we're not just here to go fast, we're here to develop judgment about where we should slow down. So if you slow down a tiny bit and announce that main idea to yourself, then you might just kind of coincidentally happen upon what one of the answer choices is talking about. So, what is the criticism of compulsory volunteering that was mentioned in the previous paragraph? We want to find that and we want to announce it. So, looking through quickly, a growing number of public schools require students to complete community service hours. So, it's required, it's compulsory. Such volunteering, be it helping, picking up, or working, has obvious benefits for the community. But critics say that making volunteerism compulsory misses the point of the act. So it's besides the point, because volunteering is the idea of deciding that you want to do this. And so the criticism is that we're missing the point if we require people to want to do something nice. It misses the point. So which of these is repeating the idea of what's the point of it? So by its very definition, it's done willingly. So missing the point is that by definition, it's this. So I love choice A for this. Whatever the work may be, choice B is talking about different kinds of work, which doesn't get to the idea that we're missing the point. For many students, so the fact that there are lots of people that this affects has nothing to do with missing the point of volunteering. And fortunately for communities, so it is fortunate that people volunteer, but that has nothing to do with the idea highlighted in purple here of missing the point of volunteering. So the one that works the best is choice A, because they talked about missing the point. What's the point of it? The point is that by its very definition, volunteer work is done voluntarily, willingly. So choice A is beautiful here. Okay, so now we're going over to question 14. By its very definition, volunteer work is done willingly. By requiring students to do community service in order to graduate, school officials. Okay, so we're talking about a little bit of a possessive right here. So we'll quickly talk about that. I might have a friend, and my friend has a boat. So this is the singular possessive. I have one friend, and that one friend has a boat. Or I may have multiple friends, and those multiple friends own a boat. So first of all, an apostrophe is used for a possessive when something belongs to the friend. In this case, the boat belongs to the friend or friends. So that calls for an apostrophe. But more importantly here, the thing before the apostrophe is going to be singular or it's going to be plural. So my one friend's boat or my multiple friends' boat. And that's how you would do either one. So when we look at choice A, we're talking about multiple school officials, which is good. So far the possessive would be good, but it would have to be the case if we were talking about something that belonged to the school officials. So for instance, school officials' lunches or school officials' offices. And of course, you don't pronounce the S that way, but it's just emphasizing. Or school officials' initiatives, right? So nothing is being placed here as belonging to the school officials. So we're going to go ahead and just get rid of choice A. So looking at choice C, school officials are taking away students' choice. So are they taking away a choice from one student? No, they're taking away a choice from multiple students. So this right here is a singular possessive, and that's what's wrong with choice C. Looking at choice D, because we're focusing on our apostrophes, school officials are taking away students' choice to give up their time for nonprofit activities. So we're talking about multiple students, and those multiple students, those plural students, have a choice, and that works here. So for number 14, the answer is going to be D. What's wrong with choice B? The students have a choice. So that is a possessive. Something belongs to the students. What belongs to them? Their choice. So Actually, I'm noticing now that the purple part was good in choice A, but the green part was bad in choice A. So we're landing on choice D. There's nothing that belongs to the school officials in this sentence, but there is something that belongs to the students in this sentence, and that's their choice to give up their time for nonprofit activities. So the answer to 14 is D. Moving on to number 15. Proponents of compulsory volunteering who are in favor of it. Well, okay, I'm noticing right off the bat that there's some repetitiveness. So we want to notice that because the dialectic is constantly about wordiness and repetitiveness versus conciseness. So do I want to include extra words and repeat stuff that doesn't need to be repeated? Or do I want to be direct and to the point and have more economy of my words, use less words? Of course, we want conciseness whenever possible. So in what way is this repetitive? If you're a proponent of something, that means that you're in favor of it. So choice A is repetitive. If you're a proponent of something, that means you're advocating it. That's repetitive as well. If you're a proponent of something, then you are the advocates. So that's also repetitive. So the right answer for number 15 is going to be choice C. Proponents of compulsory volunteering point out that it allows young people to garner the benefits that volunteering offers. So 15 is choice C. Now we're going to number 16. Which choice best provides a supporting example that is most similar to the examples already in the sentence? So it's kind of the excuse for the main idea. What are the examples already in the sentence? So number 16, students who volunteer report increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and increasingly busy schedules. So what's going on here? We're talking about, I guess we can call this parallelism in a list. So if this is about parallelism in lists, which we have, because when I read it on my own, it was easy to see that they have better self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and increasingly busy schedules. It's kind of about an auditory parallelism, something that we might refer to as like a structural integrity, if you want to get crazy with it. But there's a sound that works here. And it is something that I've been noticing more and more is common on the SAT. So just listen to the sound once again. Better relationship building skills. Okay, let me start again. Increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and increasingly busy schedules. So I like A because they kind of have that same sound each time. So the parallelism in the way they sound. So we like A. So increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills. And now what I'm noticing is actually that a busy schedule has nothing to do. So in this question, we're talking about parallelism in terms of the meaning. So what was happening in this sentence? We're talking about students who volunteer report these benefits. What are the benefits? Increased self-esteem, relationship building skills. And so we're kind of looking for a benefit as well. So we want that sort of auditory parallelism, which A was good for, but we want that semantic parallelism as well. We want these things to all be talking about benefits. So a closer connection with the community is good. Less time in social activities is not really a good thing. We want social activities, we want fun. And little increase in academic development, that's definitely a bad thing. We want more increase in academic development. So A and B both sound good, but B matches the meaning of the rest of them. So we're saying similar to the other examples, the examples were the benefits of the volunteering, and B names the benefits. So just reading it out loud again. Students who volunteer report increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and a closer connection with their community. So there's kind of the sound of it. There's the increase this, the better that, and the closer third thing. So the answer number 16 is B after that long discussion. And now we're going to number 17. I love talking about this. It comes up all the time. And on something like the SAT, the devil is in the details, because just knowing the difference between whether to use an A or an E here literally boosts your ability to get into the college of your dreams. So the word affect with an A is a verb. I am going to affect something. If I affect something, I'm doing something. It's a verb. The word effect with an E is a noun. It's a thing. So just think of someone who specializes in special effects with an E. Or I might feel the effect of something. I might feel something. So when we're using the E, we're talking about a thing. The effect is actually a noun, a person, place, or thing. So how are they using it here? Some studies have also found that students who do community service are more likely to volunteer as adults and thus affect society. They're gonna do something. They're gonna verb society positively. So we're talking about doing something here. So we like the A, which is choice B or choice D. And the difference between B and D is going to be singular versus plural. So if we're a little confused here, we can ask ourselves, well, is it singular or is it plural? Because one thing affects, look at me, I'm messing it up here. One thing affects things, and multiple things affect something. So by the way, when you're talking about singular versus plural, what you're talking about is the idea that there's one S in it. So I might say one thing affects, or multiple things affect. So we need one S in the way that we're doing it. And so now we're looking to see if we were talking about one thing or multiple things. Studies have found that students who do community service are likely to volunteer. And so we're talking about multiple students who volunteer and who affect with an A. So we're talking about multiple students affect. It says it right here. Students are more likely to volunteer and affect society positively. So for number 17, we're going with B. Going over to number 18 now. Most research looks at students who volunteer in general, not making a distinction between students who are required to volunteer by their schools and those who volunteer willingly. One recent study by Sarah Helms, assistant professor of economics at Stanford, Alabama, did focus specifically on mandatory volunteering. She found that students who were required to volunteer. Okay, so we're talking about the theme of the passage, which is students who are required to volunteer. So they define it for us a little later. So here we have a question on word choice, because we have 4 words that generally mean the same thing, but one of them is the most appropriate for this situation. And when we get a question on word choice, we want to keep our eye out for 2 things. Number 1, the slight differences in the definitions of the words make a big difference here. So we want to define each word. It is kind of a vocabulary question. And maybe about 10% of the time, in my opinion, or just a small percent of the time, we want the answer that's more formal and less casual. The SAT is absolutely a formal test, and we're not going to want words like yo, what's up anywhere in here. So here, none of the answers are overly casual, so we're not going to think about that in this situation, but we are going to kind of define each word. So, just very clearly noticing that if there is a vocabulary element to the SAT, this is the one place where it comes up. So coercive is, what would it be to coerce someone? A coercive would be almost like an angry forcing. It has a really strong connotation. Like if someone coerces someone to do something else, that could end up in the news. So I might say that this definition, coercing, is kind of too strong for what we're talking about. Like if you coerce someone, it's often a crime to sort of force someone to do what you want them to do. Forcible I might say is the same thing. Forcible is very violent. So if coercing is angry, forcible is generally violent. Like you can put a gun to someone's head and make them do something. And that's not what we're talking about here. Imperative is really not so bad. But if I have an imperative that is a little forceful, so if I really want to emphasize something, so it's maybe an emphatic word. If I want to emphasize something, I might say, guys, listen up. It is imperative that we do this thing. So it's a very serious kind of word. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about schools that, on day one of school, when they give you a lot of forms and a lot of sort of paperwork, they say, by the way, before, the end of the year, you're required to do 200 hours of community service. And so it's not that forceful, emphatic, like, look, guys, I know you're not listening to me, so it's imperative that you do something, right? It's not that same kind of forcefulness that's being discussed. It's more talking about it as like a requirement. Like when you're in college, you have to fulfill certain requirements before you can go into your major. So it's not forceful or emphatic. It's not emotional in that way. And that's why D is wrong. So for number 18, we're going with choice A. And now we can jump over to number 19. Okay, so 19 once again is about our definitions for special punctuation. So let's take advantage here and just bring in the definitions for special punctuation that we laid out a little while ago. So we'll copy these and paste them below on question 19. Okay, so looking at question 19, we can judge our special punctuation first because they have such clear rules that we can kind of narrow them out. So looking at choice B, she found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours early in high school. So, okay, for a semicolon, we need two independent clauses. So the first part is independent. It could be its own sentence. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work. So the second part would have to be its own clause. And the second part as a clause would be grammatically incorrect. There are 6 reasons for a comma, and this comma is not one of them. So it's a bad independent clause after the semicolon. So that's what's wrong with B. Looking at choice D, she found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours early in high school. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade than blah, 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 blah. So that is a good independent clause. So for number 19, we like choice D. For choice C, you have an independent clause before it that could be its own sentence. That's okay. And in the second part, you need another independent clause for its own sentence, but that comma right there just kind of ruins an independent clause. So because of the bad comma, like choice B, choice C is also wrong. Looking at choice A is an important error to look out for. It's the run-on sentence, also known in certain schools as a comma splice. So reading it in place, we would say, she found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their hours early in high school, comma, they then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade. So going through it a little quickly, we have 2 things that could each be their own sentence, 2 independent clauses with a comma between, and that's a run-on sentence. That's a very bad error. The SAT and ACT love quizzing us on run-on sentences because we use them in everyday life. But because most of the answer choices here had a lot to do with proper uses of commas, let's go ahead and go over really quickly the 6 reasons for a comma. And if you're judging a comma, you want to just ask yourself, is it one of these 6 reasons or not? And if not, then you want to consider this to be a bad comma. So the first reason for a comma would be if you have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. What's an independent clause? It has a subject and a verb, and it can be its own sentence. So my example would be, John went to the mall. That would be an independent clause. It could be its own sentence. To make it a dependent clause, you put what we refer to as an annoying word in the front. So a soft conjunction, a weak conjunction. Since John went to the mall. Now it's a dependent clause. So a dependent clause followed by an independent clause needs a comma. So since John went to the mall, comma, he was not home. So that's a dependent followed by an independent. And notice that it sounds good with a comma there. So the writers of these tests know that most of us, even some of the best of us, are judging a lot of these things based on what sounds right. So that's going to get you the answer a lot of the time. Let's say to the tune, if you're, a fairly good student, to the tune of like a 600 on the verbal section. And that's okay. But if you want to take it to the next level, you need to not just be judging things based on whether they sound right, but based on knowing the rules. And that's what we're here to teach you. So dependent clause followed by an independent. You could have two independent clauses. And if you have two independent clauses, you need a semicolon or a comma and a conjunction. And the conjunction we're talking about in this situation is the strong conjunction, the fanboys. So John went to the mall, comma, and he bought shoes. So each part of this could be its own sentence. John went to the mall, he bought shoes, and it's separated by a comma conjunction. So this is our reason number 2 of the 6 reasons for a comma. Third reason for a comma, a modifier, which we know we went over the rules for the modifier earlier, but it's a clause missing the subject, verb, or both. So John, who dates Tina, went to the mall. That's a nice common type of modifier. Goodness gracious. John, who dates Tina, went to the mall. And so just notice in the part that says who dates Tina, the subject of the sentence is John. So if the middle part were to be its own clause, independent or dependent, it would need to mention John or he. But if it's just John is the person who dates Tina, then that's not enough to be a clause. It's a modifier, and a modifier is separated by commas. Setting up a quotation. So, if you're telling a story, you might say, he said, get out of here. So we've got a quotation where we're quoting what he said, and notice that gets a comma. Then you also have a list. So he handed out 3 crayons, red, yellow, and blue. So right there in our list, we have commas. So we're going down the 6 reasons for a comma. And last but not least, a description following a description. So for instance, he entered the dark, gloomy house. Or he was in love with her long, flowing hair. So the house is dark and it's also gloomy. Or her hair was long and it was also flowing. So here we're talking about 6 reasons for a comma. And, this is one of the harder questions you'll encounter on an SAT or an ACT. It's just the simple, does this comma belong or not? And as good as you are at English, you'll kind of notice that there are just moments where, man, a comma would sound so good here, but it also would sound good without a comma. So like I said earlier, the SATs and the ACT are kind of expecting you to judge it based on whether it sounds good. So if you know the specific rules of when a comma should be used, you can get to a difficult comma situation. And if you've really got them down, you can ask yourself, was it a dependent followed by an independent? 2 independents? Was it a modifier? Was it a quotation, a list, a description following a description? And if it's none of those, then you can confidently say, okay, no, we're not going to take this comma. So that's our 6 reasons for a comma. Really, really useful. The nice thing about the SAT writing and language section, I refer to it as the English on my own. The nice thing about it is they're doing a lot of the same things over and over again. So any of the things that you see us explaining in a highlighted manner here, these are the rules that come up over and over again. If you want to boost your score immediately, You just need to go ahead and take these things and commit them to your memory. And I am really, really confident that you'll see immediate benefits on your SAT score. So let's go ahead and go on to number 20 now. Okay, number 20 is going to be a question about an illogical comparison. These are another sort of common thing that you'll be asked about, illogical comparisons. And let's go ahead and get into that a little bit. She found the students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours in early high school and then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade than the service hours. So what are we comparing? We're comparing okay, this is a little extra hard because it's connected to question 19. So when you have multiple things within one question, it's a little too much to be able to focus on. So we'll just write the word they to kind of complete this thought. They did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade. So what is being compared here is the amount of volunteer work that they did. They did less volunteer work than, now if we're doing it on our own, we're comparing it to the amount of volunteer work than the other ones did. So I'll tell you right off the bat here, the answer is going to be B. They did less regular volunteer work than did students who were required to volunteer. So we're comparing what they did to what the other people did. It's a very difficult illogical comparison question. But let's see what else it's being compared to in the other choices. In choice A, it's comparing what they did to the hours. So an action being compared to hours is not really good. Same thing here. It's being compared to the hours. And in D, it's being compared to students. So what they did compared to students doesn't really make sense. So the comparisons are bad for A, C, and D. And choice B is giving us the correct comparison. So let's go on now to question 21. Which choice effectively sets up the point made? So this is our excuse for the main idea. And when we do that, our one-liner is to announce it because it puts you in a great position of power to answer the question. So it's an excuse for the main idea, and we want to just announce that main idea. So we want to effectively set up the point made in the next sentence. So then we just have to stop, slow down, because you got to know when to slow down, and ask yourself, what is the point made in the next sentence? That is, studies show that when schools simply tell students about opportunities for community service and connect them with organizations that need help, more students volunteer of their own free will. So what's happening is that schools are simply letting students know about opportunities. And when they sort of gently let them know what's available to them, more students will volunteer. So it's better to just let people know about opportunities than it is to force them to volunteer at those opportunities. So let's look at the answer choices. So looking at choice A, schools have to recognize that not all students are equally well suited to the same activities. So does it have to do with the specifics of who is and is not well suited, like their sort of ability to be compatible with the opportunities? I think it's a little different than that. We're talking about just making people aware, and that results in more volunteering. Choice B, instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools should allow students to spend their time participating in athletics and other activities. So athletics and other activities is not the same idea as letting people know, and that will result in more people volunteering. So we're announcing the main idea of each of these, and verbally out loud, we're going ahead and comparing that to the main idea that we saw in the area that they referred us to. So looking at C, we instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools should focus on offering arrangements that make volunteering an easy and attractive choice. So we're offering is telling people, right? and making the volunteering easy and attractive. I guess that's more implied. If you offer it, people are going to volunteer because it's easy and attractive. So I like choice C. And then getting to D, instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools are advised to recognize the limits of their ability to influence. So is it because their ability to influence is limited? I don't hate that answer choice, but it's kind of has, compared to choice C, it has like one level of removal, because we said schools should tell students, and choice C says they should offer arrangements. So that is literally telling. Whereas if I say recognize the limit of their ability to influence students, that's kind of like saying, well, schools should tell students. And the reason they should tell students instead of forcing them is, if you really think about it, they have limited ability to influence their students. And that's why they should do it. But do you hear how long it takes for me to make that connection? There's sort of a level of removal. And so when we say on some of our one-liners that when you're asked for a main idea, you should announce it, it's because that announcement will directly correlate with one of the answer choices. Whereas for the wrong answer choices, for the really good wrong answer choices, like choice D on number 21, it's right, but you have to kind of stretch it to fit. And we noticed that, if there is something that we like about the SATs English section or reading section, we like the idea that, the right answers tend to be 100% right. And so in a sense, once you get used to this test, it's actually easier and better than other tests that we've taken. So looking now at number 22, the writer wants a conclusion that states the main claim of the passage. Okay, this is once again our excuse for the main idea. Look at how often this comes up. Because when we're talking about reading, we're talking about fostering that ability to quickly get the main idea by not overly zooming in and overly focusing on things that are not really relevant at that moment. And same thing when we're talking about section 2 of the SAT, we're talking about being able to kind of quickly ascertain that main idea in a quick and efficient manner. And once again, that comes from not always reading every single thing. So what's the main claim of the passage? We've sort of gone through it a bunch of times already, is that volunteering. So we're going ahead and announcing it because that's our one-liner. And the more we know these things, the more confidently we'll proceed. So the main idea is that volunteering should be optional. And we even saw in the very last question, it's because it makes volunteering an easy and attractive choice. It makes it easy, attractive, and fun for students, is kind of what it seems to me like they're saying. So which of these restates that main claim of the passage? So it's imperative that schools do their part to find volunteers. So should they be finding volunteers? That sounds a little more along the lines of forcing, which is the opposite. Schools that do this will produce more engaged, enthusiastic volunteers. We're loving this one because we're talking about people are finding it to be easy and fun. So they're engaged with it. And that's why they're volunteering. Studies in the fields of psychology and economics have revolutionized researchers' understanding of volunteerism. So is it about the studies that revolutionize things? That's not the main point. Definitely not how we said it in our own words. Looking at choice D, it's important that students choose charitable work that suits their interests and values. This is that answer choice that is kind of nice, but there's a level of removal. Because if you make it optional, people will naturally choose what suits their interests and values. But once again, do you hear how long it takes for me to make that connection? Whereas B is exactly what we say when we're judging the main idea in our own words based on what we read. So going on now to number 23. Okay, just kind of reading fast up to that point. Marsupials are a curiosity among biologists because they lack a corpus callosum, the collection of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. In most other mammals, the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left. The corpus callosum allows communication between the two. Scientists, and now I'm correcting on my own, scientists have long believed that this structure enables complex tasks by sequestering skilled movements, blah, 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 blah. So when it's a grammar-based question, it doesn't hurt to answer in your own words first. Scientists have long believed. And then look at the answer choices after that and see if any of them match perfectly. And look at that. When you answer in your own words, you end up saying the exact same words of the answer choice sometimes. Looking at number 24 now. Okay. Scientists have long believed that this structure enables complex tasks by sequestering skilled movement to a single hemisphere without sacrificing coordination between both sides of the body. This sequestration would explain handedness, the tendency to consistently prefer one hand over the other in humans. Okay, so looking at the answer choices now, what I'm seeing is that one answer choice is way shorter than the rest. And whenever that happens, we want to be thinking about wordiness and repetitiveness versus conciseness. So, as I mentioned earlier, when it's a question of wordiness and repetitiveness versus conciseness, the hard part is kind of identifying that question type. And so we want to keep our eyes out when one answer is way shorter than the others. So looking through here, this sequestration would explain handedness, the tendency to consistently prefer one hand over the other. Now reading the other choice B, the tendency to consistently prefer and favor. So to prefer and favor is repetitive. To prefer, okay, so starting over with choice C, the tendency to consistently prefer one hand over the other that could be chosen. So when you prefer something, you're preferring over something else that could be chosen. So that's kind of repetitiveness there. And looking at choice D, the tendency to consistently prefer one hand on a regular basis. So consistently means the same thing as on a regular basis. So once again, when you see wordiness versus conciseness, repetitiveness is kind of the thing you're looking out for on a lot of the wrong answer choices. So the answer for number 24 is going to be A. Now we're going to 25. We'll go ahead and bring in again our definitions of the colon, semicolon, and long dash, which we have right here. Okay, so for number 25, however, a recent finding of handedness in marsupials suggests that a trait other than the presence of a corpus callosum links handedness, bipedalism. Okay, so big deal right here. We have the colon already, and that's not up for grabs. The colon's already there, and it has to be in there. So I'm not going to want a semicolon for two independent clauses because there's a colon later, and there's no definition for having those in two different places. You could actually have two semicolons in a sentence, and that's a big exception. So I could say independent clause, semicolon, independent clause, semicolon, and a third independent clause, semicolon. That's an exception, but that's not what's going on here. We're here for choice C, we would have semicolon and then a colon later in the sentence. Choice D is two colons in the same sentence. You're never going to see that. That doesn't fit into these definitions either. And then it's a question for choice B of whether to keep or delete this comma. And we talked earlier about our 6 reasons for a comma. So we'll go ahead and bring those in real quick and see if any of these 6 reasons for a comma is being satisfied here. So let's delete our rules for special punctuation because we've already gotten rid of choices C and D. And let's talk about the 6 reasons for a comma and deliberate on whether any of these reasons are being met in choice B. So in choice B, a recent finding of handedness in marsupials suggests that a trait other than the presence of a corpus callosum. So the one that it seems like they would be going for if there was a comma there would be the idea of a modifier earlier in the sentence. But a modifier is separated by commas on both sides. So if there was a comma right here, then we would say a trait other than the presence of a corpus callosum, and then we would need another comma right here to finish that parenthetical. So if you have a modifier in the middle of a sentence, it can be separated on both sides by commas, by long dashes, because 2 long dashes counts as parentheses, or parentheses. So if anything, this comma right here, the comma that we're talking about right here, kind of points toward the use of the modifier, but it doesn't really work. So none of these 6 reasons are being met for choice B for the use of that comma. So on 25, we're going to go for A. And now we're going for question number 26. Okay. However, a recent finding of handedness in marsupials suggests that a trait other than the presence of a corpus callosum does what? So this is kind of a question on word choice, which we said will come down to the definition or the formality of it. But it's kind of combining that with idioms. Idioms are just pairs of words that go together. And so if we're talking about correlates, something should correlate with something. So that's a good idiom. And if something links, I would say something links with also, right? If I'm linking something, I want to link something with something else. So that's just the idiom for that. Now, why is that the case? Just because that's the way it's kind of been grandfathered in over the hundreds of years of society of our language. And so idioms are not as hard as they might seem. A lot of these words we know and we kind of subconsciously know. Like, so if you're wondering, well, what goes with links? Just make up a sentence in your own mind and say, okay, this thing links with that thing, and I link the other thing with the other thing. So we unconsciously know what the idiom is for linking. And we also generally would know it for correlating. Something correlates with something else. So just based on idioms, we can kind of say that choice B is the right choice for number 26. And then getting back to the idea of word choice there, I don't mind linking or correlating. A trait can link with another trait or can correlate with another trait, but it ended up being the idiom that allowed us to make that choice. So looking at number 27, which choice accurately reflects the information in the graph? Okay, so when it comes to the graphs, we want to know the main trend in the graph before we do anything else. So for instance, if we're running a company together and we sit down and talk about our profits, and I show you a chart that looks like this, then you're going to automatically know that this is optimistic. Our profits are going up, right? And that's generally what it comes down to when we're talking about graphs. So let's go ahead and look at this graph. And I'm actually going to take a little picture of it so we can look at the graph next to the question itself. Okay, so now we're ready to roll here. What seems to be the main point of this graph, looking at it myself, I'm seeing that we're talking about the handedness, the right or left-handedness of marsupials. And looking at the graph, just really generally, really off the top, we're seeing that all of them are left-handed and none of them are right-handed, because the right-handed ones would have leaned like in that direction, right? So that's our sort of general main trend of the graph. And so that's kind of us answering in our own words. They're all lefties. So looking at number 27, the scientists employed a mean handedness index. Negative scores indicated a left limb preference and positive scores indicated a right limb preference. Okay, so it's not even about how many there were, it's just about reading the graph. So does positive mean left? Yes, it does. Does negative mean right? And which answer says that? So negative means left. So A is kind of the opposite. And then just skipping ahead to C, because it looks like it, positive scores are left and negative scores are the right. So C is exactly what we're seeing when we just try to explain the graph and what it means there. So C looks good. And what's the difference between C and D? Positive scores indicated a left forelimb preference and negative scores indicated a right forelimb preference. Are they identical? Let's see what we can see about them. Ah, very clever. This is the kind of one that, before you get ready for an SAT, you got to also just make sure that you woke up on the right side of the bed that day, because the devil is in the teeny tiny little details. Look at choice C. Positive scores indicated a lack of forelimb preference and negative indicated a right. So we're talking about not a left versus a right, but a lack of versus a right. So this is where you kind of take off your hat and do a little bow for the College Board with how tricky they are on some of their questions. And, from my work with lots of students, sometimes one student will kind of catch the hang of looking out for that trickiness and they'll do well on the SAT. But the truth is that the majority of students at the end of the day, from my personal experience, will end up leaning toward the ACT. I wouldn't fret over that, because the SAT and the ACT have a lot of the same skills that are being quizzed. And I advise all of my students to start with the SAT. We consider that to be heavy weightlifting. And if, like most students, you switch over to ACT later when you're on the hot seat to try to get into college, you've already done the heavy lifting and you'll be in so much of a better position. That plan tends to work well because a minority of the students, I don't know, 20, 30% of them, will get the success they want on the SAT and never have to take that step. And like we said at the beginning of all this, it will end up kind of coming down to, some people are just a little more suited toward this little kind of detail oriented. I mean, look how hard it was with the lack of, and how easy it would be to read right through that. And so if you're someone with that kind of attention to detail and sort of love of attention to detail, then you might want to stick toward the SAT. And if not, there's nothing wrong with going to the ACT. So many of the students who get into the best colleges in the world do so because of their ACT score, not their SAT score. So looking at number 28 now, we're once again going into our special punctuation for number 28. So the thing to kind of notice here is how many of the same themes are coming up over and over again. So what's the favor that the writers of these tests are doing for us? They're asking us the same stuff over and over again, which is, like I said, why, if you see anything highlighted here on these pages, you want to try to commit that to your memory, because all you're doing is increasing your chances of getting an SAT score that you'll be proud of. So we're bringing in the rules for special punctuation, so we can go ahead and judge the answer choices on question 28. Okay, so does the semicolon in choice C work here? So we would need, for the semicolon, we would need two independent clauses. And I can see by looking at it that the second part starts with and therefore it's not an independent clause, and C is out. So now looking at choice D in number 28, I'm quickly looking through the sentence to see if I see a second long dash, because two long dashes is a set of parentheses, and there is not. So we're judging this right here as a colon, because one long dash counts as a colon. So now let's go over to the colon definition. The first part needs to be an independent clause. So let's see if that's true for choice D. What a long sentence. While eating, the eastern gray kangaroo, redneck wallaby, and red kangaroo, while eating, the eastern gray kangaroo, redneck wallaby, red kangaroo, and brush-tailed bettong, all bipedal marsupials, preferred using their left forelimb as revealed by. Okay, so we're looking at question 28, and what we're getting is kind of a list. So if you kind of read fast, like we always say, so you want to read fast, and you want to kind of be correcting it on your own first. And maybe on this one question, we could have saved ourselves some work, because reading fast and correcting on your own, you would kind of see that this is a list. The eastern gray kangaroo, redneck wallaby, red kangaroo, and brush-tailed bettong. So that's taking us over to choice B. Definitely not an independent clause before the alleged colon. So choice D is going to be wrong. And I can also tell from the awkwardness I had when I was reading it with A in place that A is also a terrible answer choice. So B is right because it gives us the commas to kind of just continue and finish our list with the word and the last element of the list. So that's our answer for question 28. Now let's go over to question 29. Which choice accurately reflects the data in the graph? So I knew better than to delete this little picture of the graph that I copied in here. But then again, the graph is right there where we need it next to us. So let's go ahead and delete it now. You know what? Maybe we'll need it later. Keep it there. Okay. So which choice accurately reflects the data in the graph? Number 29. They preferred using their left forelimb as revealed by, I would say by the, now I'm answering it on the graph based on my own. They preferred using their left, and that was revealed by the fact that they were all positive. But do I need the 0.2? The 0.2 doesn't really help me there, and it's not accurate because all of them are more than 0.2. So A is not accurate. And we're saying for choice B, positive mean handedness index values that are greater than 0.6. Are they all greater than 0.6? They're all less than 0.6. So B is also inaccurate. Positive mean handedness index values between 0.4 and 0.6. Are they between 0.4 and 0.6? They are. So we're going to pick C after this little message from Microsoft, OneNote, which I've depended upon so much for my career. So to a degree, I'm a little thankful. I'm very thankful because I've used Microsoft OneNote for so long, but it does seem that every time there's a new update, it gets more complicated and more prone to crashing. And I find that to be the case with both versions of OneNote, for the record. So now we've got choice C. The values were between 0.4 and 0.6. And so that is accurate to the graph. And just looking at choice D really quickly, the mean handedness values were not 0. So for 29, we're going to go to choice C. Now question 30, which choice provides the best transition? Now transition, they're not giving us transitional words, first of all. So for transitional words, we want to invent our own, and we might do that here. But generally, if they're asking for a transition in this manner, what they're really doing is they're giving us the excuse for the main idea. So this is a place where we invest our time in saying what came before, what came after, and what transition would we maybe invent for those two. So before, we were talking about the fact that they were all left-handed. All of these marsupials were left-handed based on the results of the experiment. So they're all left-handed. And then we see that they did not show a strong preference for the use of one forelimb. So we have the bipedal were all left-handed. So they all used one limb, primarily one limb. And the quadrupedal had not the same preference. They had no limb preference. So if we're inventing our own transition word, well, the bipedal all had one preference. The quadrupedal had no preference. So I might say, however, as the transitional word that I'm going to kind of invent here. So now, looking through the answer choices, having 4 feet, like most other mammals, in contrast to their bipedal, is the nice however. So choice C is the right one. It fits right into what we would have said in our own words on question 30. Going over to 31 now. What's a main claim of the passage? Well, we were just talking about it. The main claim is that the bipedals have a preference and the quadrupedals have no preference. Let's see if that's the claim or if we need to fish through for another claim. Kangaroos, though, still do not exhibit handedness to the extent that humans do. Okay, so is that what they're talking about later? We'll find out. For the marsupials in the study, handedness seems to be associated with bipedalism. That is the claim that we just read. So I'm liking 31. I'm liking B for 31. There are many things scientists do not understand about the marsupial brain. Doesn't really seem overly related. We're talking about what we do understand. And D, additional studies will need to be performed with other mammals. I'd be aware of that answer choice because it might be what they end up saying after this. So let's just kind of quickly ascertain what's being said in this paragraph. The quadrupeds live in trees and employ all forelimbs. The bipedals are arboreal, leaving one hand relatively free. Okay, so then I think here they're kind of doing a lot of explanation of why this is. So we're not going on to a new idea like the need for additional studies. We're explaining why. We're not asking the question of why, but we're explaining why this is probably the case. And going back to A, it's not about a comparison with humans. And so the only one left standing is B. And B kind of seems to summarize what we just said before we transition into the why. So B seems like a good choice here. Going into number 32, the bipeds, on the other hand, are far less arboreal, leaving their forelimbs relatively free for tasks in whom. Well, people are who or whom. And things are that or which. So if we're talking about a marsupial, it's not a person, so it's not who or whom. So we can get rid of A or D there. And what is kind of like what? Kind of random there, right? Because if you read it in place, leaving their forearms relatively free for tasks in what handedness might confer. So C just doesn't make sense in the story. And B works for number 32. Going over to number 33 now. The writer wants to conclude the passage by recalling a topic from the first paragraph that requires additional research. Let's take a quick look at the first paragraph and see what required more research. Marsupials are a curiosity because they lack a corpus callosum. Okay, and the corpus callosum, how it deals with the right and left hemisphere seems to be what they're talking about there. So do any of the answer choices talking about more research needed about the absence of a corpus callosum? Well, that looks just like A. We're not talking about the minority of humans who are left-handed in that paragraph. And the causes of neurological disorders just was not what I read in the first paragraph. And an additional study is planned to study handedness in other animals. That really seems valid, but as we looked through the first paragraph, we didn't see it either. So the right answer for 33 is choice A. Going to 34, which choice provides the most effective transition from the previous sentence to the information that follows? So the previous sentence says, according to the 2014 study from the Society for Human Resource Management, 54% of surveyed companies provide tuition assistance to employees pursuing an undergraduate degree, and 50% do so for employees working toward a graduate degree. So what are we noticing just reading this part on our own here? We're noticing that lots of companies actually help their employees to get their degrees, right? So which of these goes well with that idea? Although these levels are impressive, because in our own words, we said, wow, it's lots of them. So the answer to 34 is going to be choice C. And going over to 35 now, we need the main idea of the passage. So looking through, what's the main idea of this passage? More companies should consider helping employees pay. So, and then as we get into it, why should most companies help? More companies help. Let's see what it says. According to this professor, these opportunities are appealing to highly motivated and disciplined individuals and may attract better applicants. So that's the reason why. So they're saying we should offer more benefits because it attracts better candidates. So that's going to be choice D for number 35. Quickly going over to 36. So here we're talking about possessive. Is it multiple workers and their opportunities? Do the opportunities belong to the workers? I would say they do. So this word needs an apostrophe. And are we talking about one worker or multiple workers? We're talking about multiple workers. So without getting too deep into the question, we already know the answer is A, because there are multiple workers and it's a possessive because things belong to those workers. And actually, let me think about that for one extra second. It's not A, because we're not talking about, you see, this is what happens when you go too fast, right? We're offering the workers opportunities. So we're not saying the workers' opportunities are this. So that would be more of a possessive. So we're saying that they're offering their workers some opportunities. So we're actually not seeing any possessive here. So the answer to 36 is C. Nothing belongs to the workers in the way they're saying it, and nothing belongs to the opportunities in the way they're saying it. So for 36, that's C. Going over to 37, explaining his company's decision to expand its tuition assistance program, John Fox, the director of dealer training at Fiat Chrysler Automobiles in the United States, stressed the importance of. So what we're noticing when we read it fast here is that there's a modifier. John Fox, the director of dealer training at Fiat, stressed the importance. So what you really want to be doing here is reading the sentence around that modifier. John Fox stressed. And so nice and simple, if you identify that modifier, you can see for 37, the answer is easily B there. Which choice effectively combines? So we said this is one of our tougher one-liners. We're looking for flow. We're looking for transitions. We're looking for word order. And we want to avoid restarting. So paying for tuition also helps businesses retain employees. Retaining employees is important because. So the original one there, restarts, or helps them retain employees. And this retention, so that's repeating. Retain employees, the retaining of whom? That's also restarting. D is a bad semicolon because that is important, not only because. The semicolon is okay, but actually, there's a whole separate problem here. This is an ambiguous pronoun. If they use the word that right there, there's just no way to know what that, like in everyday life, you could say, well, that's important because of this and this and that. But in official writing, like something like on the SAT, we need to know what that is, and we need it to be very clear. So if we look at choice C for number 38, paying for tuition also helps businesses retain employees, which is important not only because it ensures a skilled and experienced workforce, but also because it mitigates the considerable costs of finding, hiring, and training new workers. So for 38, choice C is right, and it sounds good. And now we're looking at question 39. Before we fully get into 39, let's quickly review the rules for the colon, semicolon, and long dash. The rule for the colon is that the first part has to be an independent clause, and the second part is anything that describes the first part. The rule for the semicolon is that both parts should be independent clauses. Semicolons are for two independent clauses. And the rule for the long dash is that if there's one of them, it counts as a colon, and if there are two, they count as a set of parentheses. So we generally want to judge the special punctuation first because the rules are so clear-cut. So let's judge the colon for choice B. Employees whose tuition is reimbursed often stay with their employer even after they complete their degrees, colon, because their new qualifications give them opportunities for advancement within the company. Well, in a way, this seems to fit the definition of the colon, because the first part right here is in fact an independent clause. This part right here could be its own sentence. And the second part is describing the first part. But the problem with counting this colon as correct is something a little difficult to explain. It's actually redundant because I guess another way to say it is if the second part only included this blue part here, then this colon would be perfect because the orange part is an independent clause and the blue part is something that's describing the first part. So in other words, I guess what we're saying is that the existence of a colon is similar to the existence of the word because. They both do the same thing. And if you have them both there, then it's overkill, it's redundant. So although the orange followed by the blue with a colon in between would be perfect, having the same thing with a colon and the word because in between is overkill. It's redundant, and we don't want to do it. Choice D is a little easier to explain away. A semicolon is for two independent clauses, but because of the word because, the second part is no longer an independent clause, so we can't have a semicolon there. Choice A is also easy to get rid of because I'm going to go ahead and just extend this blue part here. The part that's highlighted in blue right now in choice A is being framed as its own sentence. And in our English 101, we talked about how the part that I'm underlining in green could have been its own sentence because it has a subject and a verb. So actually the subject would be their qualifications. It's this whole thing. So their new qualifications, give them. That's our subject-verb combination, and that's the main thing that you need in order to be your own sentence, but that's the independent clause. To make an independent clause dependent, you add exactly a word like this word right here. You add a weak conjunction to the front. So an independent clause would be something like John went to the mall, and a dependent clause would be something like since John went to the mall, before John went to the mall, after John went to the mall, the reason why John went to the mall. So the existence of the word at the front makes it a dependent clause. And the problem with choice A is that a dependent clause can't stand on its own as its own sentence. That's kind of the point of the independent clause. So the answer for 39 is going to be C. Before we get into question 40, let's review again the definitions for the colon, semicolon, and long dash. So the colon is used when the first part is an independent clause and the second part is anything that describes the first part. The semicolon is for two independent clauses, and for a long dash, one of them counts as a colon and two of them counts as a set of parentheses. So let's go ahead and get into the special punctuation parts first, since they're easier to judge because of their rules. So for choice C, is the first part an independent clause? The career of Valerie Lincoln, an employee at the aerospace company United Technologies Corporation, right there, that's not an independent clause. That couldn't stand on its own as a sentence. Mainly, if I could say why, I would say there's no verb anywhere in that blue part. So that gets rid of choice C, because for a colon, you need an independent clause first. Now for choice B, if you have one long dash, which choice B would give us, there's no other long dash anywhere throughout the sentence. But if you have one long dash, then that would count as a colon, and we already said that a colon wouldn't go there, so choice B is out as well. Now what's really going on this question is that we've got the career of Valerie Lincoln, an employee at the aerospace company United Technologies Corporation, and that is a middle modifier, the part in green. Now a modifier would be a clause except it's missing the subject, the verb, or both. And in the part that's in green here, there's no verb. There's nothing saying that she is an employee or that an employee does something. So there's no verb anywhere in there. And it's a little middle modifier that's basically giving us extra information. It's equivalent to the sentence, John, who is 6 feet tall, dates Tina. So I am saying in that sentence that John dates Tina, but by the way, I'm mentioning to you that he's also 6 feet tall. So here, the career of Valerie Lincoln, an employee at the aerospace company United Technologies Corporation, is a significant success story. So notice that the sentence completes really well as it goes into the rest of the blue part. And to make that green part a modifier, well, a modifier needs to be separated by commas on both sides, and that's what choice D does for us. So the answer for 40 is going to be D. Question 41 is a word choice question, and for word choice questions, usually we're looking at the specific definitions of each word, and occasionally we're looking at how formal or casual the word is, knowing that the SAT generally is going to favor the more formal words. So here we're talking about words that describe the knowledge of her industry. Did she have a deep knowledge of her industry, a hidden knowledge of her industry, large or spacious knowledge of her industry. So the main idea of what was going on at that moment was also that whatever they were talking about at the time allowed UTC to retain an employee who had a deep knowledge of her industry. So I could take a deep knowledge, a large knowledge, a spacious knowledge. They all generally mean the same thing, but it would be besides the point if her knowledge was hidden. Why would that be an advantage for the knowledge to be hidden? But now getting into the other three words, if you're talking about knowledge, there are certain idioms that go along with it. And idioms are words that just go together just because we've been doing the same thing, speaking the English language, for so many hundreds of years. But if we're talking about knowledge, it's okay to say you have a deep knowledge of something, but is it okay to say that you have a large knowledge of something? That's not really going to go. That's not a phrase that people use. Or a spacious knowledge. Spacious is going to be used for a literal space, like a room or a garage or a concert hall could be spacious. But knowledge is rarely or never referred to as spacious. So because of idioms, because that's just not how you say it, choices C and D don't go, and the answer for 41 is going to be A. Question 42 is a question on wordiness versus conciseness. We often know that this is the question we're dealing with because you have one answer choice that's way shorter than the others. So here we see that this answer choice is shorter than the others, and so that cues us into the idea that it's about wordiness and repetitiveness versus conciseness, and we can start looking out for repetitiveness. Well, minimizing and keeping down costs is definitely repetitive. They both mean the same thing. Looking at choice B, minimizing costs associated with coursework. Well, right here, it's already mentioned that these are associated with the coursework. And being effective at keeping costs down. Well, if I'm keeping costs down, then I am being effective. That one is a little more debatably repetitive, but as I say quite frequently, we know the SAT is looking for repetitiveness. So if something is borderline repetitive to us, then we want to go ahead and say, yes, I think this thing is repetitive. So the answer for 42 is going to be D. Question 43 is an interesting question that more than anything else, I believe, is about idioms. We're talking about classes, and the classes are likely, well, what's the idiom there? Something would be likely to do something else. I am likely to go shopping later, for instance, right? So we like that idiom that's being offered to us in choice A. Choice D kind of gives it to us as a whole different word, because if something is going to divert something or to divert something, that's different than being a diversion. A diversion is a distraction. It's a whole different kind of meaning there. And if classes are likely diverted, well, it doesn't make sense with what follows, but if something is likely to be diverted, that also has a different meaning, like in choice B. And C is just plain a bad idiom. Because you're likely to do something, you're not likely in doing something. So that's what's wrong with C, and the answer for 43 is A. Question 44 is our common SAT sentence location question, where we're being given a sentence and we're being asked where it should go. Our one-liner for sentence location is look within and imagine. So the point of that is that we want to look within the sentence for clues on where it goes and spend extra time doing that before we start looking through the passage where there are so many different things to be thinking about. Here, the sentence itself says, still, since securing an excellent workforce is crucial to success, employers should give thought to investing in reimbursement programs. So the sentence is basically saying, still, employees should give serious thought to investing in reimbursement. Since the sentence is saying still, employees should give thought to reimbursement programs, that also implies, because still is a word for opposites, something negative must have been said about reimbursement. So if I say, for instance, reimbursement is terrible, still employers should give serious thought to reimbursement programs for some other reason. So that little relational word right there tells us what to look for in the word that precedes it. So the proper place is going to be right here in choice D. Choice D is asking about is telling us about paragraph 4, and that's this paragraph right here. And notice that it was kind of giving us something negative about tuition reimbursement. Tuition reimbursement can be expensive. Companies are going to find it impractical. And even with those methods, it may not be appropriate in all cases because it's going to divert time and energy from jobs. So right here, we're hearing lots of negative things about tuition reimbursement. So it makes sense to say, still, we should give serious thought to it because of the rest of the essay. So the answer for 44 is going to be D. And thanks so much for listening to our answer explanations for College Board Practice Test 10, Section 2. Grateful can be tutoring you or your child one-on-one online in the SAT or ACT, regardless of where in the world you live. If you're interested in finding out more about that, go ahead and reach out to us. Have a great day.